Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you guys being here and spending your time with us. So my name is Dan Nealis, and I started a salt company called Great South Salt. We're an artisan salt company based in the Florida Keys. We produce solar evaporated small batch sea salt. I kind of flirted with a couple of different ideas at the beginning of the semester, so this is something that actually didn't start until October 3rd. So I had a really truncated timetable, and it's kind of interesting how I ended up planning it to make sure that I could get everything done. So first off, why Duck Key? You can kind of see there in the picture, this is actually one of the first commercial enterprises in the Florida Keys, even before Key West. They were all salt ponds, and they would ship it north to the colonies, even pre-Revolutionary War times. So there is a historical precedent, and that's kind of the reason where I got the idea. I've had a home down there for about 25 years, so it obviously made sense to be able to do it down there too. In addition to that, obviously you have very crystal clear water. You don't see that in a lot of the back bays, et cetera, in the Northeast. So what you have access to, even because of the way that the Keys are lined up, you have access to water as clear as the Gulf Stream without having to actually travel. Further the length of the season, because if you're in Nova Scotia, there's a lot of people in Cape Cod and Long Island, most of them are dealing with a 3 to 4 month, maybe 5 month season to evaporate if you want to do it solar, otherwise you have to use alternative energy sources. So that's something that I wanted to avoid. So this is a 12-month season that you can continually operate and kind of more predictably figure out your production. Finally, I did some market research and realized there's no one doing it down there. And so what I wanted to do is figure out, I could kind of take like a geographic vacuum and sort of test my market strategy in a place where nobody was doing this. So for my implementation, I mean, it sounds simple, but I was going to have to actually start producing salt. So what I had to do was build a prototype greenhouse first off, and start testing and iterating the process. So first, I kind of want to walk you through the production process. So there's 6 steps in production. First, you actually have to collect water. Again, I took my boat out and decided to do this, but I mean, in subsequent tests, you can take it from pretty much anywhere because the water's the same all over the Keys. You let it settle out for 48 hours to let any silt or anything, because there's a lot of coral silt from the reef, and then you siphon that off and filter it. The evaporation process, I wanted to use food grade everything. Because it gets so hot in the greenhouse, I wanted to make sure that we were using high density polyethylene, which doesn't leach any sort of BPAs or anything like that into your end product. It's obviously in a CO control environment, so it doesn't get in any way adulterated by anything else. Finally, you start harvesting the salt. It's really a very rough product because when you're doing it solar, it's completely different. These are all things that I had to learn. You have different crystal sizes. So you have some stuff that looks like rock salt, some of it looks like kosher salt. So you kind of have to be able to collect it all, and you have this really rough product in the beginning. The drying process, we actually wrap them in cheesecloth sacks and let it drain, kind of like making cheese. So you have about 2 pounds in each one, and then once that drains overnight, you put it in a regular food dehydrator, which really amounts to nothing more than a slightly warm breeze blowing over it to make sure that's completely dry before packaging. As far as processing, because you have that really rough product, you want to mill it down to something that looks like a uniform crystal size. And then I also wanted to make a regular and a key line blend, which you can see in front of you, that was a little bit more identifiable with the Florida Keys in general, so I had 2 different products I was producing. So I had to dehydrate whole limes and then process that and blend it. Packaging really just amounts to actually measuring by weight to make sure you have a uniformity in the actual the product that you're offering, and just sealing and affixing the labels that I had already produced and designed. So within the production cycle, there was a lot of testing that I wanted to do. Because of my timetable, I knew I only had 8 weeks, and I knew that I could really, at best, produce 2 real good shots at making something that I could offer to a market for an implementation. So what I needed to do first was actually set up a test that I knew that I wouldn't actually use, but I'd be able to learn a lot from. So what I did was I set up 12 different bins in different volumes at different levels, because I had 3 different levels in my greenhouse. What I wanted to discern was whether or not direct sunlight had an impact, which it ended up having. And I was able to measure a lot of different things along the way to see what the optimal evaporation rate was going to be and what our ultimate yield was. By measuring depth on a daily basis, by measuring the temperature inside and outside and humidity on a 24-hour sun cycle, in addition to measuring the temperature of the water itself, we were able to figure out that ultimately starting with 1 gallon is the best way to evaporate in the shortest amount of time. Anything higher doesn't get warm fast enough, anything lower cools off too quickly. So that was the best way to do it. Direct sunlight does drastically impact the evaporation process, unfortunately. The way to mitigate that is to use fans and to get some sort of dehumidifier. Unfortunately, that means that you have a little bit more of an apparatus, but it does work. What I wanted to find out was the Florida Keys have very little land. So what I wanted to do is see if I could fit this all into a 14 by 8 and have 6 layers instead of taking up a quarter acre of property trying to dehydrate seawater. So that was all really important. Now, the real yield ended up being right around 3.1%. That seems less important because it's not a variable that you can control in any way. Ultimately, the amount of salt in the water is the amount of salt in the water. The distinction is the predictability of it. For me, I wanted to be able to know exactly how much capacity I needed to produce the salt. What ended up happening, I mean, if you look at it, seawater can be anywhere between 2.7 and 3.3% effectively. What you end up with is to produce 200 ounces of salt, which is what I thought I needed to implement. You would have, at 2.7%, you need 57 gallons. At 3.3, you need 47 gallons. So I don't have a place to put that extra 10 gallons of water, so I actually needed to figure out exactly what the yield was, even for a prototype basis. Lastly, and this was kind of funny, the way that I had set it up, it wasn't sealed on the bottom, my whole greenhouse apparatus, and it was sitting on top of coral sand, so someone at some point must have walked by with a leaf blower, because that destroyed my entire first 2 weeks worth of work. But we did get a lot of feedback, so it was worthwhile. So for my second test, we reset the greenhouse sitting on a concrete porch away from any sort of landscaping potential issues. I set it up with 24 bins because we now knew that 1 gallon was the way to do it, so that was going to let me do 100 ounces every 2 weeks. I individually screened each one on the off chance that anything could possibly get inside of it, and I did seal the bottom of the greenhouse at that point. And at the same time, while I let that happen, what I did was separately, I boiled 6 gallons of water to make 1.5 pounds of salt. That allowed me to actually start working with it and start testing the other parts of the process before I actually had salt that I could use from the solar evaporation process. That was important because I needed to know about drying, I wanted to know about the milling process, and I really wanted to test 20 or 30 different recipes for the keyline blend before actually going to market with it. As far as branding, I wanted something that wasn't the typical tacky Florida Keys, 5 o'clock somewhere image. I wanted something a little bit more, I don't know, provincial, tropical, whatever you want to call it, but it had to be a little bit better. You can see from my original example versus what my brand designer ended up coming up with. I feel like he did a better job than I, but I think we were on the same page. What I ultimately wanted to do was try to target tourists, and in that you would need to have some sort of branding that's going to be, reflecting the tropical culture of the Florida Keys. This is a personal learning that I got out of this because I'm trying to marshal resources and sort of bootstrap this whole thing without spending too much money. And so I have a friend that's a brand designer and did this for me. Trying to figure out how to get someone motivated to do something for you without paying them was an interesting learning for me. There was actually a lot of different files, a lot of different sizes, and a lot of different things that went into it that I didn't expect. And it was a harder project than I thought for him. Just from a cost basis, the 3 main streams were production, packaging, and marketing. They're all roughly the same. Now, the initial investment, a lot of it has a long life, so you don't really have to replace a lot of this stuff. So when you actually look at it, ultimately, what you have is actually a decent contribution margin. When you look at the numbers, this is just looking at the keyline blend. What you really need is packaging, labeling, and a constant stream of limes because you can't just use the bush in your backyard. It ends up about 2.5 months you could break even with your total investment at this stage where I am now. For my market test, what I wanted to do, and you can see here that I set up a little farmer's market, we wanted to test just the keys, like I was saying, in that vacuum. And so what I thought I could do is test whether or not locals, and there is a very local, buy local kind of sentiment down there. I think it's because they're geographically separated from mainland. So there's that sentiment, and I really wanted to see if tourists would look at this as a real souvenir product. So I set up at a farmer's market in the Middle Keys in Marathon, it's halfway between Key Largo and Key West. And we expected to see a good amount of traffic from both tourists and locals. Unfortunately, our predictions weren't met. We didn't sell what we thought we would, having nothing really to do with anything that I did. It turns out Thanksgiving weekend in the Keys, that Saturday, no one's really around. And that's just a fact. I mean, that's anecdotal feedback from residents, locals, and the owner of the produce market itself that I set up at. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to reset the whole test at a fee-based market. It's a lot more akin to what you would think of as like a Christmas market. There's probably 50 different vendors. It's a small fee, but there's hundreds and hundreds of people and a lot of foot traffic. So I think you're going to be able to get a lot more feedback from that test. The one thing that I did get for validation was from social media itself. People having no idea who I was at all, just having tweeted this out and then retweeting it, they came back to people that I knew within their own networks saying, you know, this is a really cool idea, where can I get it? This would be a great holiday gift for my family. I didn't expect that. I wasn't really thinking that anyone would care about this as that sort of feedback. So that was an interesting learning because that wasn't something that I was ever predicting in the first place. It turns out locals don't identify with the way that tourists look at the Florida Keys. They don't see their home as that, and they want something a little bit more, you know, the way that they see their thing that they can send to their family that they can identify with. So that, in a nutshell, is how you start a sea salt company in 8 weeks. Thank you.